As the saying goes, get woke, go broke. We, the people, recently learned that 200 woke corporations, part of the Civic Alliance, and 90 CEOs in a Zoom call, went on record to oppose election integrity laws in Georgia. These corporations think they know what's best for we, the people. These corporations think they wield more power than we, the people. These corporations openly flaunt and thwart the will of we, the people. These corporations hide behind legal terms like personhood, thereby giving said corporations, dead entities, rights like we, the people. These corporations virtue signal at every opportunity what values we, the people, should embody. We, the people, have forgotten how to play the game, and it's time we, the people, step into the light of the Great Awakening. We, the people, have more power than they know. We, the people, have the ability to vote with our dollars. We, the people, have had enough of the fraud and are collectively throwing up the window and yelling, "We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore." We, the people, keep our tongues from evil and our lips from speaking lies, while these corporations have given their mouth to evil and their tongues frame deceit. We, the people, will have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of these corporations. Rather, we, the people, admonish them. We, the people, having souls, know our rights are inherent and come by the hand of God, whereas these corporations are soulless and rely upon man for their privileges, masquerading as rights. We, the people, will continue to witness the destruction of the old guard. And we, the people, will build around, through, and without these corporations. So help us God. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Hey everybody, Spectre here. How we doing? Hey, this is a re-record of a show that I did on PSB back on the 17th of June here, 2021, and I thought it was worthy enough to go back through from a historical perspective here. Pretty good article and subsequent material that went along with it. For whatever reason, the archives didn't pick it up, so that being said, here we go. Thomas Jefferson versus the Federal Reserve, a favorite topic of mine, talking about the old Federal Reserve, and it's going to mix in some of the Federalist Papers and subsequent documents and that from the era here. Good article penned by Michael Meharry for Shift Gold here, and here we go. It says the Federal Reserve is the engine that drives one of the biggest, most powerful governments in the history of the world. Without the Fed, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for the government to fund its foreign wars, its massive, unsustainable social programs, the ever-growing police state, and the tangled web of corporate welfare programs. It's almost certain none of this would exist as we know it today, not even close. The federal government would truly be limited. Although the Federal Reserve is relatively new within the scope of American history, its roots go back to the early days of the Republic and the first Bank of the United States, chartered by Congress on February 25, 1791. A national bank was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton. His rationale wasn't much different from those who later came up with the Federal Reserve. Hamilton thought a central bank was necessary to stabilize and improve the fledgling nation's credit and to better manage the financial business of the United States government. The notion of a national bank, but wasn't without its detractors. One of the most vocal opponents of the bank was Thomas Jefferson, who argued that it was unconstitutional. The debate was really about more than chartering a bank. At its core, it was an argument about the extent of federal power. Jefferson held the promise of the ratification debates that federal authority would remain carefully circumscribed by the enumerated delegated powers. Given that the Constitution doesn't authorize Congress to charter corporations, much less a national bank, Jefferson argued that it was an unconstitutional act. On the other hand, Hamilton pivoted from the position he took during the ratification debates and justified his project by invoking the doctrine of, quote-unquote, implied powers. His arguments foreshadowed how federal policies of every imaginable stripe would be justified moving forward. Arguably, Hamilton's arguments for the first bank of the United States set the foundation for much of the federal overreach we have today. Jefferson and Hamilton both wrote documents making their cases for the establishment of the bank. Jefferson wrote his opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank first. He rested his argument on the 10th Amendment, writing, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states or to the people. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition." He then succinctly stated his conclusion. The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by the Constitution. Jefferson proceeded to outline the various clauses of the Constitution supporters of the bank used to constitutionally justify and explained why they failed to bear the burden of that power. The primary justification was the Commerce Clause, but Jefferson argued that to erect a bank and to regulate commerce are very different acts. Erecting a bank actually creates an institution of commerce, and as Jefferson pointed out, to make a thing which may be bought and sold is not to prescribe regulations for buying and selling. Let me repeat that point one more time. To make a thing which may be bought and sold is not to prescribe regulations for buying and selling. Two very different acts, you see. He went on to argue that if erecting a bank is an exercise of the commerce power, it would be void, because it would also impact commerce within individual states. For the power given to Congress by the Constitution does not extend to the internal regulation of the commerce of a state, that is to say, of the commerce between citizen and citizen, which remain exclusively with its own legislature, but to its external commerce only, that is to say, its commerce with another state, or with foreign nations, or with the Indian tribes. Next, Jefferson tackled the General Welfare Clause, pointing out that Congress cannot lay and collect taxes for any purposes it pleases, but only to pay the debts or provide for the welfare of the Union. Likewise, Congress can't do anything it pleases to promote the general welfare. It can only further the general welfare by laying taxes and acting within its enumerated powers. In like manner, they are not to do anything they please to provide for the general welfare, but only to lay taxes for that purpose. To consider the latter phrase, not as describing the purpose of the first, but as giving a distinct and independent power to do any act they please, which might be for the good of the Union, would render all the preceding and subsequent enumerations of power completely useless. It would reduce the whole instrument to a single phrase, that of instituting a Congress with power to do whatever would be for the good of the United States, and, as they would be the sole judges of the good or evil, it would also be a power to do whatever evil they please. It is an established rule of construction, where a phrase will bear either of two meanings, to give it that which will allow some meaning to the other parts of the instrument, and not that which would render all the others useless. Certainly, no such universal power was meant to be given them. It was intended to latch them up straightly with the enumerated powers, and those without which, as means, these powers could not be carried into effect. Jefferson drove his point home by pointing out a very inconvenient fact for Hamilton. the Philadelphia Convention debated and rejected delegating the power to charter corporations. On one of the final days of the convention, James Madison proposed the federal government be delegated the authority to, quote, grant charters of incorporation where the interest of the U.S. might require and the legislative provisions of individual state may be incompetent, end quote. Rufus King of Massachusetts objected specifically on the grounds that it will be referred to the establishment of a bank, which has been a subject of contention in those cities, New York and Philadelphia. He also warned that in other places it will be referred to mercantile monopolies. George Mason of Virginia proposed limiting the power to chartering corporations for the construction of canals. He was afraid of monopolies of every sort, which he did not think were by any means already implied by the Constitution, as supposed by Mr. Wilson. Ultimately, the convention rejected the proposal completely. Historian Dave Banner wrote, "This casts overwhelming doubt on the notion that the Constitution allowed Congress to form such monopolies. No enumerated power to grant monopolies and corporate charters was ever included in the document, and during the ratification campaign, none of the Constitution's advocates cited the presence of such a power." But Hamilton's arguments didn't rely on the existence of any delegated power. Instead, he appealed to the existence of unwritten, implied powers. Aha, and here the subversion begins, right? In response to Jefferson's appeal to the 10th Amendment and the federal government can only exercise delegated powers, Hamilton affirmed it and then effectively nullified its limiting force. He wrote, "The main proposition here laid down in its true signification is not to be questioned." But he continued, insisting, "It is not denied that there are implied well as express powers, and that the former are as effectually delegated as the latter. But who decides the extent of these implied powers? Who determines their limits?" In effect, Hamilton sets up an almost unlimited reservoir of power the general government can dip into in order to take whatever actions it deems appropriate. This was a 180-degree reversal from the position he took during the ratification debates, when he insisted that the new general government would only exercise limited powers. Hamilton primarily based his defense of the National Bank on the necessary and proper clause, citing it as the source of these implied powers, while Jefferson relied on a very narrow definition of necessary and proper. Hamilton used the phrase to milk implied powers out of the Constitution. The debate centered on the meaning of the word necessary. Jefferson took a very narrow view, arguing that the government can carry out all of its enumerated powers without a national bank. A bank, therefore, is not necessary, and consequently not authorized by this phrase. It has been urged that a bank will give great facility or convenience in the collection of taxes. Suppose this were true, yet the Constitution allows only the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient, for effecting the enumerated powers. If such a latitude of construction be allowed to this phrase as to give any non-enumerated power, it will go to everyone, for there is not one which ingenuity may not torture into a convenience, in some instance or other, to some one of so long a list of enumerated powers. It would swallow up all the delegated powers and reduce the whole to one power, as before observed. Therefore, it was that the Constitution restrained them to the necessary means, that is to say, to those means without which the grant of power would be nugatory. Hamilton found this view too limiting. He wrote, "It is certain that neither the grammatical nor popular sense of the term requires that construction. According to both, necessary often means no more than needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive to. It is a common mode of expression to say that it is necessary for a government or a person to do this or that thing, when nothing more is intended or understood than that the interests of the government or person require, or will be promoted by, the doing of this or that thing. To understand the word as the Secretary of State does would be to depart from its obvious and popular sense, and to give it a restrictive operation, an idea never before entertained. It would be to give it the same force as the word absolutely or indispensably had been prefixed to it. Jefferson hit the problem with Hamilton's view on the head. It opens up the door to virtually unlimited government power. This runs counter to James Madison's assurance in Federalist No. 45 that the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Under Hamilton's implied power doctrine and his loose reading of the necessary and proper clause, there is very little the federal government can't do. After all, virtually anything could be defined as needful or useful to the government. During the ratification debates, opponents of the Constitution worried that the necessary and proper clause would be construed exactly as Hamilton read it. At the time, Hamilton swore they had nothing to worry about. In Federalist No. 33, he wrote, "It may be affirmed with perfect confidence that the constitutional operation of the intended government would be precisely the same if these clauses, necessary and proper, and the supremacy clause, were entirely obliterated, as if they were repeated in every article. They are only declaratory of a truth which would have resulted by necessary and unavoidable implication from the very act of constituting a federal government, and vesting it with the certain specified powers." Hamilton pivoted from specified powers in 1788 to implied powers just 3 years later. In his push for a bank, Hamilton also invoked a rule of construction very favorable to the government. He wrote, "This restrictive interpretation of the word necessary is also contrary to the sound maxim of construction, namely that the powers contained in a constitution of government, especially those which concern the general administration of the affairs of a country, its finances, trade, defense, etc., ought to be construed liberally in advancement of the public good." This was not a sound maxim of construction at the time. St. George Tucker was an influential lawyer and jurist, and he wrote the first systematic commentary on the Constitution. Published in 1803, View of the Constitution of the United States served as an important law book, informing the opinion of judges, lawyers, and politicians for the next 50 years. He explained that we should always construe federal power in the most limited sense possible. The powers delegated to the federal government are, in all cases, to receive the most strict construction that the instrument will bear, where the rights of a state or of the people, either collectively or individually, may be drawn in question. This is the exact opposite of Hamilton's maxim, as Light Horse Harry Lee put it during the Virginia Ratifying Convention. When a question arises with respect to the legality of any power, exercised or assumed by Congress, it is plain on the side of the governed. It is enumerated in the Constitution. Is it enumerated in the Constitution? If it be, it is legal and just. It is otherwise arbitrary and constitutional. When political power resides in the people, the default position should always be to assume the most limited government power possible, not the most liberal reading, as Hamilton insisted. Later in his life, Jefferson made a similar point in a letter to William Johnson. On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or intended against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. There was no probable construction authorizing chartering of a national bank. Reading Hamilton's arguments for the bank, it becomes clear he was trying to squeeze meaning and power out of the Constitution. Under the limited general government promised by supporters of the Constitution during ratification, including Alexander Hamilton, there would have been no national bank. Hamilton's twisting of the Constitution to wring out new powers set the stage for much of the federal overreach that would follow. It was the foundation for the living, breathing Constitution we live under today. Very interesting read here, obviously. And of course, if you look at the overreach, certainly, that we have here today, they like to assume that the Constitution is living and breathing, not a dead document. And of course, we see through the court systems and lawyers and lawfare and everything else the twisted view and reading and meaning of some of the words in the Constitution when it fits their needs, obviously. Implied powers, enumerated powers, all those things come to play here, but I do tend to agree with his assessment that they tried to squeeze meaning out where they likely shouldn't have. And of course, if we got rid of the Federal Reserve today, I think we would be much better off. So, that being said, let me go through some of the actual documents that were included in this here, and we'll bang through those here quickly. So one of the things they highlighted was Jefferson's opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank, Yale Law School, Lillian Goldman Law Library, the Avalon Project, right along the lines of the Federalist Papers and that I've gone through in the past here. The bill for establishing a national bank undertakes, among other things, to form the subscribers into a corporation, to enable them in their corporate capacities to receive grants of land, and so far is against the laws of mortmain, to make alien subscribers capable of holding lands, and so far is against the laws of alienage. To transmit these lands on the death of a proprietor to a certain line of successors, and so far changes the course of descents. To put the lands out of the reach of forfeiture or escheat, and so far is against the laws of forfeiture and escheat. To transmit personal chattels to successors in a certain line, and so far is against the laws of distribution. To give them the sole and exclusive rights of banking under the national authority, and so far is against the laws of monopoly. To communicate to them a power to make laws paramount to the laws of the states, for so they must be construed to protect the institution from the control of the state legislatures, and so, probably, they will be construed. I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. To take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible of any definition. And of course, we saw that quip and that in the article. The incorporation of a bank and the powers assumed by this bill have not, in my opinion, been delegated to the United States by the Constitution. They are not among the powers specially enumerated, for these are, first, a power to lay taxes for the purpose of paying the debts of the United States, but no debt is paid by this bill, nor any tax laid. Were it a bill to raise money, its origination in the Senate would condemn it by the Constitution. To borrow money, but this bill neither borrows money nor insures the borrowing it. The proprietors of the bank will be just as free as any other money holders to lend or not to lend their money to the public. The operation proposed in the bill, first to lend them $2 million and then to borrow them back again, cannot change the nature of the latter act, which will still be a payment and not a loan. Call it by what name you please. To regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states and with the Indian tribes, to erect a bank and to regulate commerce are very different acts. He who erects a bank creates a subject of commerce in its bills. So does he who makes a bushel of wheat or digs a dollar out of the mines. Yet neither of these persons regulates commerce thereby. To make a thing which may be bought and sold is not to prescribe regulations for buying and selling. And of course, I repeated that a couple of times throughout the article. Interesting point. Besides, if this was an exercise of the power of regulating commerce, it would be void, as extending as much to the internal commerce of every state as to its external. For the power given to Congress by the Constitution does not extend to the internal regulation of the commerce of a state, that is to say, of the commerce between citizen and citizen, which remain exclusively with its own legislature, but to its external commerce only, that is to say, its commerce with another state, or with foreign nations, or with the Indian tribes. Accordingly, the bill does not propose the measure as a regulation of trace, but as productive of considerable advantages to trade. Still less are these powers covered by any other of the special enumerations, nor are they within either of the general phrases, which are the two following: to lay taxes to provide for the general welfare of the United States, that is to say, to lay taxes for the purpose of providing for the general welfare. For the laying of taxes is the power, and the general welfare the purpose, for which the power is to be exercised. They are not to lay tax ad libitum for any purpose they please, but only to pay the debts or provide for the welfare of the Union. In like manner, they are not to do anything they please to provide for the general welfare, but only to lay taxes for that purpose. To consider the latter phrase not as describing the purpose of the first, but as giving a distinct and independent power to do any act they please, which might be for the good of the Union, would render all the preceding and subsequent enumerations of power completely useless. It would reduce the whole instrument to a single phrase, that of instituting a Congress with power to do whatever would be for the good of the United States, and, as they would be the sole judges of the good or evil, it would be also a power to do whatever evil they please. It is an established rule of construction, where a phrase will bear either of two meanings, to give it that which will allow some meaning to the other parts of the instrument, and not that which would render all the others useless. Certainly no such universal power was meant to be given them. It was intended to latch them up straightly within the enumerated powers, and those without which, as means, these powers cannot be carried into effect. It is known that the very power now proposed as a means was rejected as an end by the convention which formed the Constitution. A proposition was made to them to authorize Congress to open canals, and an amendatory one to empower them to incorporate. But the whole was rejected, and one of the reasons for rejection urged in debate was that when they would have a power to erect a bank, which would render the great cities, where there were prejudices and jealousies on the subject, adverse to the reception of the Constitution. The second general phrase is to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the enumerated powers, but they can all be carried into execution without a bank. A bank, therefore, is not necessary, and consequently not authorized by this phrase. If has been urged that a bank will give great facility or convenience in the collection of taxes, suppose this were true, yet the Constitution only allows the means which are necessary, not those which are merely convenient, for effecting the enumerated powers. If such a latitude of construction be allowed to this phrase as to give any non-enumerated power, it will go to everyone, for there is not one which ingenuity may not torture into a convenience, in some instance or other, to some one of so long a list of enumerated powers. It would swallow up all the delegated powers and reduce the whole to one power, as before observed. Therefore, it was that the Constitution restrained them to the necessary means, that is to say, to those means without which the grant of power would be nugatory. But let us examine this convenience and see what it is. The report on the subject, page 3, states that only general convenience to be the preventing the transportation and retransportation of money between the states and the Treasury. For I pass over the increase of circulating medium ascribed to it as a want, and which, according to my ideas of paper money, is clearly a demerit. Every state will have to pay a sum of tax money into the Treasury, and the Treasury will have to pay, in every state, a part of the interest on the public debt, and salaries to the officers of government resident in that state. In most of the states, there will still be a surplus of tax money to come up to the seat of government for the officers residing there. The payments of interest and salary in each state may he made by Treasury orders on the state collector. This will take up the greater part of the money he has collected in his state, and consequently prevent the great mass of it from being drawn out of the state. If there be a balance of commerce in favor of that state against the one in which the government resides, the surplus of taxes will be remitted by the bills of exchange drawn for that commercial balance. And so it must be, if there was a bank. But if there be no balance of commerce, either direct or circuitous, all the banks in the world could not bring up the surplus of taxes, but in the form of money. Treasury orders then and bills of exchange may prevent the displacement of the main mass of the money collected without the aid of any bank, and where these fail, it cannot be prevented even with that aid. Perhaps indeed bank bills may be a more convenient vehicle than Treasury orders, but a little difference in the degree of convenience cannot constitute the necessity which the Constitution makes the ground for assuming any non-enumerated power. Besides, the existing banks will, without a doubt, enter into arrangements for lending their agency, and the more favorable, as there will be a competition among them for it, whereas the bill delivers us bound to the National Bank, who are free to refuse all arrangement, but on their own terms, and the public not free, on such refusal, to employ any other bank. That of Philadelphia, I believe, now does this business by their post notes, which, by an arrangement with the Treasury, are paid by any state collector to whom they are presented. This expedient alone suffices to prevent the existence of that necessity which may justify the assumption of a non-enumerated power as a means for carrying into effect an enumerated one. The thing may be done, and has been done, and well done, without this assumption. Therefore, it does not stand on that degree of necessity which can honestly justify it. It may be said that a bank whose bills would have a currency all over the states would be more convenient than one whose currency is limited to a single state. So it would be still more convenient that there should be a bank whose bills should have a currency all over the world. But it does not follow from this superior conveniency that there exists anywhere a power to establish such a bank, or that the world may not go on very well without it. Can it be thought that the Constitution intended that for a shade or two of convenience, more or less, Congress should be authorized to break down the most ancient and fundamental laws of the several states, such as those against mortmain, the laws of alienage, the rules of descent, the acts of distribution, the laws of escheat and forfeiture, the laws of monopoly? Nothing but a necessity invincible by any other means can justify such a prostitution of laws, which constitute the pillars of our whole system of jurisprudence. Will Congress be too straight-laced to carry the Constitution into honest effect, unless they may pass over the foundation laws of the state governments for the slightest convenience of theirs? The negative of the President is a shield provided by the Constitution to protect against the invasions of the legislature. 1. The right of the executive. 2. Of the judiciary. 3. Of the states and state legislatures. The present is a case of a right remaining exclusively with the states, and consequently one of those intended by the Constitution to be placed under its protection. It must be added, however, that unless the President's mind on a view of everything which is urged for and against this bill is tolerably clear that it is unauthorized by the Constitution, if the pro and the con hang so even as to balance his judgment, a just respect for the wisdom of the legislature would naturally decide the balance in favor of their opinion. It is chiefly for cases where they are clearly misled by error, ambition, or interest that the Constitution has placed a check in the negative of the President. Though the Constitution controls the laws of mortmain so far as to permit Congress itself to hold land for certain purposes, yet not so far as to permit them to communicate a similar right to other corporate bodies. And there we see that. Again, this was the Jefferson's opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank. All right, so continuing on, also referenced in the article, we talked about the Madison debates. Again, you can kind of scroll through those. This dating clear back to September 14th, 1787. In the convention, a little back and forth. Mr. Williamson motions in that who voted which way or the other. Article 1, Section 3, the words by lot were struck out. Let's see. Mr. Rutledge and Mr. Governor Morris moved that persons impeached be suspended from their office until they be tried and acquitted. Again, more back and forth on that. Mr. Mason and Mr. Jerry moved to insert the words parts, the word of the proceedings of the Senate. So again, some of that is also included. The Congress may be joint ballot appoint a treasurer. Move to strike out this power and let the treasurer be appointed at the same manner with their officers. Mr. Gorham and Mr. King said that the motion, if agreed to, would have a mischievous tendency. The people are accustomed and attached to that mode of appointing treasurers, and the innovation will multiply objections to the system. Mr. Governor Morris remarked that if the treasurer be not appointed by the legislature, he will be more narrowly watched and more readily impeached. Mr. Sherman, as the two houses appropriate money, it is best for them to appoint the officer who is to keep it, and to appoint him as they make the appropriation, not by joint but several votes. General Pinckney, the treasurer, is appointed by joint ballot in South Carolina. The consequence is that bad appointments are made, and the legislature will not listen to the faults of their own officer. And of course, there's a motion to strike out all the various yeas and nays in that regard. Article 1, Section 8, but all such duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the U.S., was unanimously annexed to the power of taxation. And there's a couple more in here as well. Moving along, we also talked a little bit about the Federalist Papers, number 45. If you're on the channel here or on the archives, you can find those there as well. The alleged danger from the powers of the Union to the state governments considered for the independent fournal. This penned by Madison to the people of the state of New York. Having shown that no one of the powers transferred to the federal government is unnecessary or improper, the next question to be considered is whether the whole mass of them will be dangerous to the portion of authority left in the several states. The adversaries to the plan of the convention, instead of considering in the first place what degree of power was absolutely necessary for the purposes of the federal government, have exhausted themselves in a secondary inquiry into the possible consequences of the proposed degree of power to the governments of the particular states. But if the Union, as has been shown, be essential to the security of the people of America against foreign danger, if it be essential to their security against contentions and wars among these different states, if it be essential to guard them against those violent and oppressive factions which embitter the blessings of liberty, and against those military establishments which must gradually poison its very foundation, if, in a word, the Union be essential to the happiness of the people of America, is it not preposterous to urge as an objection to a government without the which objects of the Union cannot be attained, that such a government may derogate from the importance of the governments of the individual states? Was then the American Revolution effected? Was the American Confederacy formed? Was the precious blood of thousands spilt, and the hard-earned substance of millions lavished? Not that the people of America should enjoy peace, liberty, and safety, but that the government of the individual states, that particular municipal establishments, might enjoy a certain extent of power, and be arrayed with certain dignities and attributes of sovereignty? We have heard of the impious doctrine in the old world, that the people were made for kings, not kings for the people. Is the same doctrine to be revived in the new, in another shape, that the solid happiness of the people is to be sacrificed to the views of political institutions of a different form? And so, obviously, again, if you've been with me over the years, you can go back on the old channel there and take a listen to Federalist Paper number 45. Also talked about Federalist Paper number 33. The same subject continued concerning the general power of taxation. From the Daily Advertiser, January 3rd, 1788, penned by Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. The residue of the argument against the provisions of the Constitution in respect to taxation is engrafted upon the following clause. The last clause, the 8th section of the first article of the plan under consideration, authorizes the national legislature to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the powers by that Constitution vested in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. And the second clause of the 6th article declares that the Constitution and the laws of the United States made in pursuance thereof, and the treaties made by their authority shall be the supreme law of the land, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. And again, same thing, you can go back on the old channel here and listen to the read-through of Federalist Paper number 33. And we also saw from Thomas Jefferson to William Johnson a letter penned dating clear back to June 12, 1823, almost 200 years ago now. So I'll take a little bit of a read through this here real quick. It says, Dear Sir, our correspondence is of that accommodating character which admits of suspension at the convenience of either party, without inconvenience to the other. Hence this tardy acknowledgment of your favor of April 11th. I learn from that with great pleasure that you have resolved on continuing your history of parties. Our opponents are far ahead of us in preparations for placing their cause favorably before posterity. Yet I hope, even from some of them, the escape of precious truce in angry explosions, or effusions of vanity, which will betray the genuine monarchism of their principles. They do not themselves believe what they endeavor to inculcate. That we were an opposition party, not on principle, but merely seeking for office. The fact is that, at the formation of our government, many had formed their political opinions on European writings and practices, believing the experience of old countries, and especially of England, abusive as it was, to be a safer guide than mere theory. The doctrines of Europe were that men in numerous associations cannot be restrained within the limits of order and justice, but by forces physical and moral wielded over them by authorities independent of their will. Hence their organizations of kings, hereditary nobles, and priests. Still further, to constrain the brute force of the people, they deem it necessary to keep them down by hard labor, poverty, and ignorance, and to take from them, as from bees, so much of their earnings as that unremitting labor shall be necessary to obtain a sufficient surplus barely to sustain a scanty and miserable life. And these earnings they apply to maintain their privileged orders in splendor and idleness, to fascinate the eyes of the people and excite them in as humble adoration and submission as to an order of superior beings. Although few among us had gone all these lengths of opinion, yet many had advanced, some more, some less on the way, and in the convention which formed our government they endeavored to draw the cords of power as tight as they could obtain them, to lessen the dependence of the general functionaries on their constituents, to subject them to them those of the states, to weaken their means of maintaining the steady equilibrium which the majority of the convention had deemed salutary for both branches, general and local. To recover, therefore, and practice the powers which the nation had refused, and to warp to their own wishes those actually given, was a steady object of the federal party. Ours, on the contrary, was to maintain the will of the majority of the convention, and the people themselves. We believed with them that man was a rational animal, endowed by nature with rights, and with innate sense of justice, and that he could be restrained from wrong, and protected in right by moderate powers, confided to persons of his own choice, and held to their duties by dependence on his own will. We believe that the complicated organization of kings, nobles, and priests was not the wisest nor best to affect the happiness of associated man, that wisdom and virtue were not hereditary, that the trappings of such a machinery consume, by their expense, those earnings of industry they were meant to protect, and, by the inequalities they produced, expose liberty to sufferance. We believed that men, enjoying in ease and security the full fruits of their own industry, enlisted by all their interests on the side of law and order, habituated to think for themselves and to follow their reason as their guide, would be more easily and safely governed than with minds nourished in error, and vitiated and debased, as in Europe, by ignorance, indigence, and oppression. The cherishment of the people then was our principle, the fear and distrust of them that of the other party, composed, as we were, of the landed and laboring interests of the country. We could not be less anxious for a government of law and order than were the inhabitants of the cities, the strongholds of federalism, and whether our efforts to save the principles and form of our Constitution have not been salutary. Let the present republican freedom, order, and prosperity of our country determine. History may distort truth, and will distort it for a time, by the superior efforts, justification of those who are conscious of needing it most. Nor will the opening scenes of our present government be seen in their true aspect until the letters of the day, now held in private hoards, shall be broken up and laid open to the public view. What a treasure will be found in General Washington's cabinet when it shall pass into the hands of as candid a friend to truth as he was himself, when no longer, like Caesar's notes and memorandums in the hands of Antony, it shall be open to the high priests of federalism only, and garbled to say so much, and no more than suits their views. And again, I'll go ahead and drop the link out there for those that wish to read on, but very interesting the way this reads, and look at how things have played out here today, and read it again for yourself. And last but not least, one of the things highlighted here out of the old 10th Amendment Center, Mike Meharry, again published on June 10th here, says, "A living, breathing Constitution is really a dead one." Let's take a listen.
Mike Meharry here, National Communications Director at the 10th Amendment Center. Did you realize that at its core, the American Revolution was a constitutional crisis? We usually hear about taxation without representation, or more generally a fight against tyranny, and this is certainly true. But the root cause of the colonists' frustration was this feeling that the British had disregarded the constitutional system, that they had changed the constitutional rules in the middle of the game. The problem for the colonists was that the British Constitution wasn't written down anywhere. It was literally a living, breathing constitution, and the government could change the rules at a whim. This is exactly why that after the colonists won their independence, they insisted on a written constitution. When you hear people talk about a living, breathing constitution, it is antithetical to America's founding principles. You have to have it written down so you know its limits and you can hold the government to them.
All right, so there you have it. In the words of the author there, you have to have it written down to hold them to the tenets of what is written down. If it's living and breathing, it's all, whatever. Fly by night. They can do as they see fit. And what do we see play out here today? Do we not see those very same things? Do we not hear the various folks in charge, the Pauls and that in D.C., talk about a living, breathing Constitution when it is convenient to them? Says the whole concept of a living, breathing Constitution is antithetical to the founding principles. The American colonists fought a war to free themselves from that kind of a system. And here we are, some 250 years later, still fighting the very same things. And again, for further reading, Constitution 101, living and breathing is the same as dead. 9 reasons the living, breathing Constitution view is a lie. Early Americans would have rejected the U.S. government of today. Certainly. So, there you have it, folks. In a nutshell, going back through, again, what was titled an article here, looking at this from a money sense, Thomas Jefferson versus the Federal Reserve, the constitutionality of whether or not a corporate bank should have even been chartered, whether or not Congress should have the power to do so, powers enumerated versus implied powers, that sort of thing. And again, if you look at how things have played out here, we know that they like to run ripshod over the Constitution, interpret it as they see fit, rather than on its surface and in the spirit of the debates that took place when the Constitution was ratified. So again, like I said, this is a rebroadcast of a show I did on the 17th of June here over on PSB. I wanted to get this back out there. I thought it was important to get this out, especially in the context of some of our old founding documents, those that were behind it, as well as one of my favorite topics to talk about, the old Federal Reserve here. So that being said, all of that is going to be out there. I'll go ahead and drop the links out there. You guys can peruse the rest of the old documents, Federalist 33, 45, etc. And you guys can take a look at that for yourself. And appreciate you guys tuning in, as always, and we'll see you back on the next one. Take care. God bless.